Can you identify with this statement I'm about to make? When I was little, people would say that I was very well behaved. And then when I became a teenager, people would frequently say that, I'm speaking of adults, that I was mature beyond my years, that I was very grown up. But then when I became grown up, people would tend to say sometimes that I behaved a little bit aloof or maybe just out of touch. My behavior really didn't change that much. It was the perception. Framed by my age, the people drew that conclusion. Now, can you identify with that? There were kids in my school and in my neighborhood and in my church, wherever I encountered kids who were kind of rowdy. We would say they are extroverts. And people would say when they were little that they are so misbehaved. And when they were teenagers, they would say they are so immature. They need to grow up. But now that those same kids are adults, they say that they're very charismatic. They are extroverts. They make good salespeople. Can you identify with that? What is the difference? What's going on here? Well, as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that, in fact, this occurred to me a very long time ago, that there was a spectrum, and on one end there were people who were very charismatic. And their charisma seemed to carry them through life. Okay, here's a story. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think I read it on Wikipedia. But I'm thinking of an actor you know by the name of Dick Van Dyke. Particularly if you are older, you'll remember him from television. Speaking of age, I'm almost 70 years old, so I've got some experience here. But the story was that when he was younger, he was auditioning for a Broadway play. Well, it was a musical. And it required him to dance. Now, everybody knows that Dick Van Dyke is an excellent dancer because we have seen him. But at the time, he was not a dancer. As far as I know, he had never studied dancing. He had never done any dancing whatsoever other than maybe, well, no more than any other young man. And so he went in to audition for this musical that required him to be a dancer, even though he could not dance, and they hired him on the spot. Now, the story is the reason they hired him, not because he could dance, because he couldn't, but because of his personality, because of his charisma. And I heard a similar story about a rock star, not going to mention his name, because I'm not positively sure this is accurate, but suffice it to say he grew up in Seymour, Indiana. You can Google it later to find out who it is if you want. But the story is, early in his career, he cut a record or a recording. I think he had a tape. It wasn't actually a record. And he took it to a producer to audition the recording, because he wanted a recording contract. He was just beginning his career, and he wanted someone to take him on. And the story is that the producers, the production company, didn't listen to his audition recording, his audition tape. But like Dick Van Dyke, they signed him based upon his charismatic personality. And again, I don't know if that's true, but I know such things happen frequently, but I'm like 99% that's an accurate story. So we see here that it seems that people who are charismatic seem to often, not always, have an edge in life based upon their personality. Now, I have met people like that, but in Hollywood they call this just it. People have it. They have that personality that falls in love with a camera, falls in love with the people who are watching the movie screen. And so I'm wondering, people like us who are on this spectrum, particularly those of us who have Asperger syndrome, are we at a disadvantage because we are not charismatic? And by the way, what is the opposite of the word charismatic? I tried to find it, and I didn't like the answers because one of them was repulsive, and that doesn't really fit, because I know a lot of introverts who are not repulsive at all. So I don't know. But so we're going to use the terms introvert and extrovert because those are familiar to most everybody. But you know what I'm saying. I'm talking about people with Asperger syndrome versus those who have extroverted, charismatic personalities. And with few exceptions, we're just opposite ends of the spectrum. And there is a spectrum, by the way. There's some people who are very charismatic, kind of charismatic, just in the middle, and so forth. And this was first brought to public attention by Carl Jung, a psychologist who, I think he died in 1960s, 1961. But I think he brought this to the world's attention like in 1920, so it's been around for like 100 years. It's nothing new whatsoever. So what is the difference between people with Asperger syndrome and those who are charismatic, between those who are introverts and those who are extroverts? And again, I got to emphasize that not everybody with Asperger syndrome is an introvert. In fact, there are cases, and if you are familiar with Asperger syndrome, which I assume you are, you wouldn't be watching the video, but if you are familiar with people with Asperger syndrome and the syndrome itself, you know that some people express their Asperger's by being outgoing, sometimes to a fault. They can be very, very noisy, and they can be very bothersome to the teacher. It's kind of like the kid that the people said he's a troublemaker. But by and large, well, virtually every person I ever met who has Asperger syndrome was an introvert. But just so you understand, there are some exceptions. Well, let's take a look at these things. The differences between those who are extroverted and those who are introverted, or those who are charismatic and those who are the typical, the normal Aspies. Number one is this: inward versus outward loop. Now, I use the term loop, and why do I use the term loop? It's for this reason. According to Jung, Carl Jung, people who are extroverted, they need to express themselves. It's like something inside of them. They just can't help but get it out. And so they are very talkative, very friendly, very outgoing, because I have to be. It's like there's a nervous energy. I don't think Jung said this, but there's like a nervous energy that they just got to kind of explode on other people. And then they get positive feedback. And that encourages them to be even more charismatic, outgoing, which, more feedback. And that's part of the story. But I got to tell you that I have encountered people over my life, and I'm sure you have too, like those Hollywood people, you know, that have the it that we were talking about. Individuals who just command respect by virtue of their presence. Now, I haven't met very many people who are excessively like this. In fact, in my entire life, and again, I'm like almost 70 years old. My entire life, I've only met one person that truly, genuinely fit rather that profile. I went to school at a place called Liberty University back when it was a college, and I would encounter, you may remember, Jerry Falwell. That is the only person that I ever met in my life who had that charismatic presence, where just by virtue that he was in the room, he commanded respect. I don't know what that was, but I remember there were some kids, some of the guys at school, who tried to emulate that. They tried to copy it. Oh, they were not the same. It was kind of obvious that they were being fake. So the point is, this is something that cannot be faked. Okay, number two is this. Number one was inward versus outward loop, because people who are charismatic, with exceptions, who are extroverts, tend to have that loop where they need to express themselves and it feeds back. And people who are introverts, just the opposite. We feed ourselves inwardly and we find that rewarding, and so we express ourselves inwardly. And that brings us to number two, and that is piano versus basketball. I often wondered what piano players did. People were extremely gifted at playing the piano before there were pianos. That seems to be so very unfair. I mean, I've heard people just really unbelievably, amazingly talented. And it just bothers me knowing that those people, or people like them, lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago when pianos weren't invented yet. Well, that's kind of off topic, but the point is people who are good at piano tend to be, and again with exceptions, but they tend to be introverted because it requires them to study alone. I mean, it's really hard to practice piano when there's a lot of noise around you. But basketball players, on the other hand, when I was a kid, I loved to play basketball, but I typically played basketball by myself. But by and large, if you're going to be a ball player, particularly on a school team or professional, you got to be social. You got to be outgoing to some point. Now, you can still be an introvert, you can still be an Aspie, but by and large, because, well, it's a team sport. It's a social sport. It's a team sport. So people are different. Now, that brings us to this question, and are we talking about nature or nurture? And I tend to believe, and I'll tell you why, I tend to believe it's almost entirely nature that we're born this way. And the reason is, many, many years ago, there was or I should say there were, two little puppies that found their way into our flower garden in front of our house. And if I recall, one of them was white, one of them was black, and I don't remember the difference other than that, or which was which, I should say. But it was kind of obvious that somebody had dumped them. You know, somebody didn't want them, and they didn't know what to do with them, couldn't find anybody to take them, and so they just dumped them. And we live near a rural area that happens rather frequently, but I don't know, maybe they just ran away from home, but we couldn't find a place for them. Finally, somebody came and got them. But the reason I bring up the puppies is because one of the puppies was very, very, very aggressive. Not in a bad way, just really friendly, like to jump around, and just happy, happy, happy puppy. And the other, and again, I don't remember if it was the white one or the black one, but the other puppy was just the opposite, just the opposite, and just really reserved. Just kind of wanted to do nothing but lay around, and he didn't seem to be sick, didn't seem to be anything wrong with him. He just wasn't an extrovert. So realizing those were puppies, and they couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, maybe a couple months at the most, they really didn't have time to be impressed by their environment, and considering they were obviously siblings because they looked alike other than their color, and they were the same age, so they probably came from the same litter, they were probably treated the same. So maybe not with 100% certainty, but it's almost 100% certainty that their behavior, you know, the one with charisma, the one that was outgoing, the one that was an extrovert, was that way by nature. And the one who was an introvert, same thing, by nature. Now, yeah, environment does influence everybody. We know that. No argument about that. But I think when we are dealing with ourselves, when we're dealing with who we are as introverts or extroverts, that it is probably very beneficial to ask ourselves, why am I like this? Why are we like this? And I think this is just the way that nature has produced us. Combination of genetic factors. It's in our DNA. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing, just a thing. But again, those who tend to be charismatic, those who tend to be outgoing, those who tend to be extroverts, tend to get a better shake in life. Okay, if you're an Aspie, you know how difficult it is to keep a job. You could go to work and you could be the best employee in the sense that you're a hard worker and you know your job and you have a good attitude and you show up on work on time. You don't show up intoxicated or whatever. You're just flat out good employee. But within 6 months, they want to get rid of you because you just don't have that social, what would you call that? Social ability? Put those two words together. sociability, I guess. I don't know. But you just don't seem to have that, so you make people uncomfortable. People don't like to be uncomfortable, so they're left with two options. Number one, they can quit the job, get away from you. Or number two, they can try to get you fired. And inevitably, very few people are going to quit their job so they can get away from an introvert. So they decide that you're a bad apple somehow, and so they want to get rid of you. And I know a lot of people with Asperger syndrome. I don't know them personally, but I've heard about them who just can't keep a job. They're well trained. They're highly intelligent. They're really good at what they do. Got that great attitude, but they're not charismatic. In fact, they're the opposite end of whatever word we decided that is. Of the opposite end of the spectrum, whatever that is, that's what they are. And so, they're rejected. That is piano versus basketball. Best analogy I could come up with. Well, if you can think of a better one, leave it in the comment section. Number 3 is rewards versus punishment. That's really kind of what we just talked about, but that is that if you are charismatic, if you are an extrovert, chances are you're going to fare better in life simply because you're better at making friends. Now, a lot of advancement in life, talking about financial advancement, career advancements, is based upon who you know. You got to be social. You got to be, with very, very few exceptions, you got to be social. Because people know people and they will give you a job suggestion, or maybe they're working someplace and they will put in a good word for you to get you hired. Then once you get in, everybody likes you and everybody says, this is a great guy. And even though this great guy, this charismatic, likable person that everybody just loves, may be dumber than a box of rocks, but everybody likes him, so he gets promoted. Now, some of these people aren't dumb. Some of them are highly intelligent and they deserve to be promoted. But the point is, those of us who tend to be introverted, we get overlooked simply because we are who we are. Is that fair? Well, guess what? Life is not fair, so we have to work around it. Now, personally, the way I was able to work around that is I was self-employed. I just worked for myself, and I worked with people, but they were my employees. So if they don't like me, who are they going to complain to? The government? The government doesn't care. I mean, maybe if I did something criminal, they probably would, but I didn't. And so, I was able to get around that social trap. Not so in my early years. I found it very difficult to keep a job, but once I was self-employed, hey, it worked very well. All right, so number 3 is what we call rewards versus punishment. Number 4 is this. And by the way, these are in no particular order, just thoughts as they came to my mind, is what I call talk versus think. Now, when I say talk versus think, I mean extroverts talk. Always, 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 there are exceptions. But extroverts talk, and then they think, maybe. Whereas introverts think, and then they talk. Maybe. So we're like opposites when it comes to thinking and talking. Most extroverts that I know, they just don't seem to think. I mean, their brain has to be working or they couldn't talk at all, but they just blurt out whatever. And everyone's okay with that because, well, they just make them feel warm and fuzzy, make people feel good about themselves. And in so doing, they may say something that is totally untrue or something that is totally wrong or something that normally would be considered rather offensive, something that if I were to say, people would be shocked. Can't believe he said that. But the extrovert says it, gets away with it. Then later he may think, probably shouldn't have said that, if he thinks at all. Whereas introverts, those of us who are Aspies primarily, we tend to be thinkers. Again, the piano player. The guy who is into computers needs to focus, needs to concentrate, can't have a lot of noise or racket around him, can't have chitter chatter and people talking and people explaining what their problems are in their home life, as if anybody cares, and don't care. The person with Asperger's really doesn't care to hear about your latest surgery. Not that he doesn't care or she doesn't care, but they're focusing on their work. Don't need to hear about that. So people with Asperger syndrome tend to be writers or like to write because, well, people outside will call them loners. Remember that thing I said at the very beginning? When you're little, they say that you're well behaved, and when you're a teenager, they say you're mature, and when you're adult, they say that you're aloof. Well, sometimes as an adult, they say you are a loner. This guy I heard that a lot when I was in college, particularly from the staff. They say, well, they would kind of analyze the students, and they would notice that this guy, Ken, he's just always by himself. Not always, but primarily by myself. I was, and they were right, I guess. I am a loner. I don't think that's a bad thing. They seem to think like it was some kind of a flaw, like I was mentally ill. What's wrong with this guy? Why doesn't he socialize like normal people? So, okay, yeah, we tend to be loners, and as such, we like to focus on what we're doing. For example, making this video. I cannot do well making a video like this if there are a bunch of people trying to talk to me or talking to each other around me. It'd be very distracting. As it is, the most distracting thing I have to deal with is if the neighbor's dog starts barking, and I don't find that distracting. I find it actually kind of adds to the interest of the video. All right, that was number 4. Talk versus think. We're inverted. What they are, we aren't. What they are, we aren't. Number 5 is competition versus cooperation. Just very briefly, one of the things I've noticed is that extroverts tend to make excellent warriors. Now, when I say warrior, I don't necessarily mean on the battlefield. Could be competition of business. Virtually every business leader, with some exceptions, is not only an extrovert, but many of them are flat out psychopaths. Now, I can think of notable exceptions. I can't think of the guy's name. Who's the guy that heads up Tesla? I'll think of it after the video is over, but if you can remind me, just put it in the comments. But they say he has Asperger syndrome. So there is one notable exception of a guy who made it to the top. But I'm thinking in his early days that it was like he and one other person were working on computer code, and they did that, like 18 hours a day. That's the story, anyhow. But cooperation versus competition. Extroverts make good warriors. They like to compete. They like sports. It's a team sport, and they like to win. They don't just like to compete. They like to defeat the other guy. Whereas introverts, well, we tend to make good peacemakers. We don't like to fight. We don't like the jostling back and forth with, again, always with some exception, but introverts tend to be peacemakers because fighting, at least to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's just dumb. I mean, why would you do that? Wherever you go, you're surrounded by your circumstances. So you say, I'm going to rise above my circumstances. No, you're not, because when you rise up, guess what? You're still surrounded by something. And that's what the word circumstance means. It means your surroundings, your circle, your circumstance. So you can't leave your circumstances. Well, if you do, you're still surrounded by circumstances. So you say, okay, I'm going to move out of this neighborhood. I'm going to go to an entirely different state, maybe a different country, because I don't like my circumstances. Well, guess what? Whenever you get wherever you're going, you're going to have circumstances. Be different, but there's still going to be circumstances. And chances are, with the challenges that you're confronting with your circumstances now, you're going to face the same thing where you get, your destination. Maybe you need some relief. Say if you're in a high crime rate area, then you want to move somewhere safer. That would be the obvious exception. Many things like that. But if you're dealing with things that have to do with you personally, well, if I just move somewhere else, people will see me differently. Maybe, but I'm thinking they're going to still see you as an introvert. If you're an adult, they may very well see you as a loner or as aloof. So go ahead, change your circumstances, but you're just taking them with you. They are your baggage, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think could be, but I think it's largely a good thing. Competition versus cooperation. We tend to be cooperators. I don't understand why people hate those with whom they disagree. You know, I know people who are fans of ball teams, and they sometimes come to physical blows over a ball game. How dumb is that? I mean, how silly is that? I know people involved in politics or religion or whatever. They get mad at each other. They just disagree. I mean, why do people have to hate each other? Because they have different thoughts. They have different wavelengths going through their brain. I don't get it. But obviously, extroverts do. Makes perfect sense to them, not to me. And so we say there is a difference between extroverts and introverts because there is a desire for competition among extroverts, whereas introverts like to be peacemakers, cooperation. Number 6, and finally, is this. Hey, this is a good one. Embrace versus escape. Extroverts, as we said earlier when we first began this presentation, extroverts derive their energy from not just from crowds, but they seem to derive energy from loud crowds. Okay, remember the analogy of the ball team? I'm thinking basketball because I'm in Indiana, but if you're in Alabama, you're probably thinking football. But okay, in Indiana, we're thinking basketball. Nothing worse than a quiet crowd. They come to see, the fans in the stands, which I don't know why they call them stands because nobody's standing. Well, sometimes they do, but they go there to sit. Why don't they call them sits instead of stands? I don't know. So anyhow, they go when they're in the sits or the stands, whatever, and if they're good fans, they make a lot of noise because the extroverts who are on the ball team thrive in all that racket. I have never, ever, ever been in a bar. A place where you go get alcohol. Can't remember ever being in one. But I've seen them on television. And from what I've seen, they're loud places. And I guess people who go there, okay, the alcohol kind of helps them along, be extroverts, but they're loud and noisy. I remember when I was a kid watching Westerns on TV, and they would always have a brawl. Every single Western I ever watched, again, with exceptions, they always had a barroom brawl. Always. I figured that's just what you do when you go to a barroom. You go in there, have a drink, and everybody fights each other. All right, it wasn't that naive, but that's the way it seemed. But that's what stimulates an extrovert. They like that noise. They like the competition. They like the fight. They like the racket. They like the busyness. They like to contribute to that, and they feed off of that. And that helps them, encourages them, motivates them, challenges them to do more of what they do, which is go to bars and fight. Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. They like to be extroverted. Whereas Aspies, those of us who are introverted, we find crowds, they're stimulating, but they're overstimulating. I don't know too many people who don't like to go to theme parks. Oh, let's go to Disneyland and stand in line for 2 hours and nobody speaks English. Why would anybody want to do that? Let's go to, there's a fair in town. Let's go to the fair and we'll just have fun wasting our money. All the noise and the lights, people love that stuff. And the popcorn, it's expensive. What do they call it? Cotton candy? Okay, I like the cotton candy. But outside of that, Fireworks? Are you kidding me? I don't want to go to fireworks. But people love them, and I'm as patriotic as you can get. But I'm a quiet patriot. I don't like that stuff. But yeah, it's stimulating, but it's overstimulating. It's just too loud. We have a lot of videos on this channel, and our videos are what are called evergreen. That means they're fresh. They just stay fresh. You can watch them anytime, and they're just as powerful today as they were when we first made them. And you can see some of those videos by clicking on the links that are on your screen right now.